In the dusty, unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a quiet blacksmith named Caleb Kane Stone has traded his violent past as a U.S. Marshal for the simple life of a craftsman. His new home, the small town of Redemption, is his sanctuary, a place where he can finally find peace. But peace is a luxury in the West, and it's about to be shattered when the ruthless railroad baron, Silas the Serpent Thorn, rides into town. He brings with him a dark promise of progress and a chilling reminder of the life Kane left behind. Silas wants redemption, and he'll stop at nothing to take it. With his past staring him down and the lives of the townsfolk hanging in the balance, Kane must make an impossible choice: cling to the peace he's found or pick up his gun one last time.
Before we get started, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I've got something truly special coming your way tomorrow.
The sun beat down on Redemption with a familiar malice, a relentless anvil striking the dusty plains of the Arizona Territory. The air shimmered, thick with heat and the fine, red dust that coated everything: the cracked boards of the general store, the sun-bleached sign of the saloon, and the weathered hands of the town's quiet protector, Caleb Kane Stone. He was a man shaped by fire, both literal and metaphorical. In the forge, the heat was a living beast, a furnace that roared with a primal hunger. But it was a predictable heat, one he could control. Unlike the furnace of his past, inside the iron heart of his workshop, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil was a steady, resolute heartbeat for the town. Each strike sent sparks flying like golden insects into the gloom, a stark contrast to the chaotic, discordant violence he once knew. Here, with the scent of hot iron and coal smoke heavy in the air, he was simply a blacksmith. His hands, calloused and powerful, no longer held a lawman's revolver, but tongs and a hammer, shaping tools for a new life. He was a man who had traded in a badge for an apron, a gun for a chisel, and a life of high stakes. Justice for the simple, honest work of making horseshoes and mending plows. He was in the middle of shaping a horseshoe, the iron glowing a furious, blinding orange, when the screen door of his forge burst open. A small, frantic silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed by the glare of the desert sun. It was Billy, the son of the town's saloon keeper, a boy whose freckled face was usually lit with a mischievous grin, now contorted with worry. "Mr. Kane, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Wallace are at it again," he blurted out, his voice thin with panic. Kane set his tongs down with a quiet sigh. Old Man Henderson, a wiry man with a face like a dried apple, and Joe Wallace, a bear of a man with a temper to match, had been at odds for weeks over a creek that snaked through their adjacent properties. It was a petty squabble, a minor chord of discord in the town's fragile peace, but it had begun to fester like a wound. Kane walked out of the forge and into the blinding light, his broad shoulders casting a long, cool shadow on the parched earth. He moved with a deliberate slowness, an unhurried grace that was a testament to his years as a U.S. Marshal, a man who had learned that a quiet presence could be more powerful than a drawn gun. "What's the trouble, gentlemen?" His voice was low and calm, but it carried the quiet authority of a man who had seen more than his share of human folly and violence. Henderson pointed a trembling finger at Wallace. "He's diverted the creek," My corn's gonna dry up and die." "I've done no such thing," Wallace retorted, his face red with fury. "The creek's run dry on its own. It's God's will, not mine." Kane didn't respond immediately. He just walked slowly between them, his gaze taking in the landscape of their small conflict. He didn't need to hear their arguments. He had seen this story play out 1,000 times in 100 different towns. Greed and fear, the two oldest ghosts in the West, haunting even the most insignificant of disputes. Finally, his eyes settled on a few stones piled on Wallace's property, a clumsy and obvious attempt to reroute the meager flow of water. "Those rocks weren't there yesterday, Joe." Kane's voice was still calm, but it held an edge of finality. "You know that, and I know. That, and God knows it, too." Wallace's bravado crumpled under Kane's steady, knowing gaze. He lowered his head, kicking at the dirt like a chastised boy. "Just trying to get by, Kane," he muttered, the fire gone from his voice. Kane nodded. "We all are, but not by taking from our neighbors. Move the rocks back, now." Wallace cursed under his breath but started to obey. Henderson grumbled his thanks, but Kane just nodded and returned to his forge. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He was just a blacksmith. He preferred it that way. He'd traded in a life of high-stakes violence for the simple, honest work of shaping steel. He'd found a fragile peace here in Redemption, a town that was a quiet testament to his new life. But as he plunged the glowing horseshoe into a barrel of water, the hiss of steam a sharp sigh in the stillness, he couldn't shake the feeling that his past was about to come calling. And this time he wouldn't be able to just move a few stones to fix it. The sun, a relentless forge in the sky, was finally beginning its slow descent, painting the western horizon in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. A hush had fallen over Redemption, a quiet that promised the end of the day's toil and the beginning of an uneasy rest. But that quiet was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the land. It was the rhythmic thunder of hooves, not from the usual dusty riders or battered supply wagons, but from something heavy, something foreign. Every head in town turned as a dust cloud billowed up from the trail, announcing the arrival of a vehicle that was both an omen and an assault on the senses. It wasn't a wagon or a buggy. It was a black, finely appointed stagecoach, pulled by 4 stallions as black and sleek as a raven's wing. The leather was polished to a high sheen. The brass fittings gleamed like gold in the fading light, and the horses moved with a synchronized power that spoke of expense and professional care. It was a vehicle designed not for the rough country, but for the smooth, sophisticated thoroughfares of a world far away. The coach rolled to a graceful stop in front of the saloon, its silence a sudden, jarring punctuation, mark after the roaring thunder of its arrival. The door opened, and a man stepped out with an easy confidence that seemed to defy the very dust he stood on. He was tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in a dark suit that was as out of place as a cathedral on the plains. His hands were spotless, his boots unblemished. He wasn't a man of the earth. He was a man who owned it. This was Silas the Serpent Thorn. He smiled, a practiced, charming gesture that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was followed by 2 men who moved with a silent, predatory grace. They were not dressed in fine suits, but in worn leather and dusty clothes their faces hard and expressionless. They carried no visible weapons, but their hands rested near their hips in a way that telegraphed their deadly purpose. They were the muscle, the teeth of the snake. Silas looked around, his gaze sweeping over the town's humble buildings, the dusty general store, the worn-down hotel, the humble houses. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. His smile widened. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried over the sudden stillness. "Ladies, I represent the Union Pacific. We're looking to expand our line, and redemption sits on a most advantageous piece of land." The words were an olive branch, but the tone was a threat. He strode toward the town hall, a place no bigger than a large shed where the council was just gathering. He didn't ask to be let in. He simply entered, and the door was held open for him by one of his men. He laid out a polished plan, full of promises of jobs, growth, and prosperity. He spoke of the future as if it were a tangible thing he held in his hand, a gift he was offering them. But beneath the veneer of progress was a quiet, insidious menace. He spoke of progress, but what he meant was control. And Cain, watching from the shadowy entrance of his forge, understood the truth. He'd seen men like Silas before. They were a different kind of predator, one who used honeyed words and iron will to take what they wanted. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like cold dread, that this was not a negotiation. It was the beginning of a siege. The saloon air hung thick and stale, a heavy quilt of whiskey, fumes, cigar smoke, and the nervous sweat of a town on the brink of a decision. Every man at the bar, every group huddled around a card table, had only one thing on his mind: Silas Thorne. The name was a low, constant hum, a lit fuse snaking across the splintered floorboards. Was he a savior or a devil? The arguments were a tangled web of hope and suspicion. Cain, stone, his wide shoulders hunched slightly over a glass of amber liquid, sat in a quiet corner, a silent witness to the unfolding debate. He didn't speak, didn't offer an opinion. The men knew his stance was not for sale, not for promises of easy money or a railroad line. They respected his quiet integrity, but today they were too consumed by the prospect of prosperity to listen to a man whose wisdom was rooted in what they saw as a bygone era. A small part of him felt a profound weariness. He had spent a decade building this life, trading the weight of a star on his chest for the honest heft of a hammer. He'd learned to read the seasons, the grain of wood, the temper of steel. He had learned to read the men in this town, too, and he knew they were vulnerable. They were good people, homesteaders and small business owners, men who knew how to work hard but not how to fight a ghost from his past, and that was exactly what Silas Thorne was, a ghost. The name alone, so full of history and bloodshed, had settled like ash in the pit of Cain's stomach. He hadn't laid eyes on the man, just seen his picture on a poster once, but he knew the type. A man who promised progress but delivered ruin. A man who came with clean hands and a dirty soul. A shadow fell over his table, blocking the dim, dusty light from the windows. The scent followed it, not the familiar smell of worn leather and stale whiskey, but something sharp and artificial, a cloying sweetness of an expensive cologne mixed with the faint, expensive scent of a fine cigar. Well, well, a smooth voice purred, cutting through the noise. Look at what the cat dragged in. Kane's hand, calloused and thick with the grime of his forge, instinctively stilled around his glass. He knew that voice. It was a sound he had heard in courtrooms, in empty alleyways, and once, echoing through the canyons during a gunfight, that had claimed 3 good men. It was the voice of a viper, charming and poisonous all at once. He turned slowly, his gaze climbing from the polished boots to the crease of tailored trousers, up the flawless vest, and finally to the face. The years had been kind to Silas Thorne. His features were still sharp, his jawline strong, his eyes a piercing blue that glittered with a cold intelligence. But the same smile, all teeth and no warmth, was still there, a thin line across his face. Cane Stone, Silas said, extending a hand that was unervingly clean. He didn't offer to shake. It was a gesture of ownership. Or should I call you Marshal? You've certainly fallen a long way from a badge to what is it, a blacksmith? His gaze swept over Kane's grimy hands and his simple, rough-spun clothes, and a look of genuine amusement flickered in his eyes. Kane ignored the hand and the insult. Silas, he said, the name a stone in his mouth. I heard you were building railroads. Last I heard, you were robbing them. A laugh, sharp and brief, escaped Silas's lips. It didn't reach his eyes. A man changes his business. You should know. Marshal to blacksmith. I'm surprised you remember me. But I never forget a face, especially not one that's been on the wrong end of a barrel more than once. I remember you, Kane said, his voice a low rumble. You've got a memorable way of leaving a trail of bodies behind you. The saloon was quiet now, the low hum of conversation replaced by a curious silence. The patrons were used to Kane's quiet nature, but this was different. This was 2 men who knew each other in a way that spoke of history and bad blood. Silas leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. I have a proposition for you, old friend. The town wants to vote on my offer. I've heard you've got some pull here. Tell them to take the deal. It's for the best, for them. And for you, the railroad is coming one way or another. You can either be on the tracks or under them. His voice was honeyed, but the threat was a cold shard of glass in the words. Felt his blood run cold. He didn't care what Silas did to him, but this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the people of redemption. It was about a future he had hoped they could have in peace. They'll make their own choice, Kane replied, his gaze locked with Silas's. And they won't be listening to me. Oh, I think they will, Silas said, a menacing glint in his eye. A man's reputation precedes him. Kane, they know you were a marshal. They know you're a man of conviction. You convince them, and everyone walks away happy. You refuse. And dwell. Accidents happen. To people, to property. Say that boy who brought you the message earlier, the one with the bright smile. What was his name? Billy? It would be a terrible shame if something were to happen to him, wouldn't it? Kane's hands clenched into fists, a muscle in his jaw ticking. He wanted to reach across the table and snap this man's neck. He wanted to go back to the days where the law was a gun and a man's honor was measured in lead. But he buried that man deep. You're out of your element, Silas? Kane said, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't some town on the border where you can ride in and take what you want. These people have roots, Silas laughed, a genuine, mirthless sound this time. Roots? They're just weeds waiting for the hoe. Cain, I've got the power of the future on my side. You're standing on the wrong side of history, trying to live a lie. You can't escape what you are. You're a man of violence. The only difference between you and me is that I embrace it. You run from it. And you're about to find out that a man who runs is always faster than the one chasing him. Until he isn't. He took a long, slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Cain's. The quiet standoff was palpable, a silent promise of the violence to come. Silas had said enough. He had delivered his ultimatum and had shown his hand. He wasn't interested in a fair fight. He was interested in victory, no matter the cost. Cain paid for his drink and walked out. He didn't rush. He didn't look back, but he could feel Silas's eyes on his back, a brand of ownership. He walked back to his forge, the familiar streets now feeling foreign and dangerous. He looked at the horseshoe he had been working on, a symbol of his new life. It felt heavy in his hands, no longer just a piece of metal, but a weight he had to carry. The piece was over. The game had changed. Silas Thorne had just reminded him that he wasn't just a blacksmith, a man who hammered steel into useful shapes. He was Cain Stone, the marshal, and his past wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing monster that had just walked back into his life and was about to burn his new world down around him. He knew now what he had to do. He had to stop running. He had to pick up his guns again. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting for the law, but for his home. The last stand had begun. The town hall smelled of stale cigar smoke and sawdust, a familiar scent to Cain. Yet tonight it felt different. It was the scent of a town at a crossroads. The council meeting had been called to discuss the railroad's offer, but the real issue was the man who made it. Silas Thorne. Cain stood in the back, leaning against the cold stone wall. He wasn't a man for speeches, and he certainly wasn't a politician. He was a man of action, and every fiber of his being was screaming at him that action was coming. He watched the faces in the room, a sea of hope and uncertainty. The hope was what scared him. They saw a future of opportunity, of prosperity, of an end to the brutal, grinding poverty of the plains. They didn't see the man behind the promise. They didn't see the serpent. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a nervous habit of smoothing his mustache, cleared his throat. Folks, you've all heard the offer. Mr. Thorne promises to build a station right here in Redemption, a real hub for the territory. He's offered a fair price for the land, and we stand to gain a great deal from this. Jobs, trade, a connection. To the world, a murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Old Man Henderson, who had so recently been in a land dispute, spoke up. This could be a godsend, Mayor. My family's been scraping by on this land for 30 years. Maybe it's time to let go and get something for it. Maybe it's time for a change. Cain's jaw tightened. He knew Silas wasn't offering a fair price. He was offering just enough to tempt them, to divide them. He'd learned long ago that the devil never comes in a red suit with a pitchfork. He comes with a promise of heaven on earth. As the discussion continued, a young schoolteacher, a woman named Clara with fierce, intelligent eyes stood up. "With all due respect, Mayor, what are the costs? What happens to the people who don't want to sell? What happens to the values this town was built on?" Mr. Thorne's offer is a temptation, but I've read about men like him. They promise progress and deliver ruin. A few of the townsfolk grumbled. They wanted to believe in the promise. But Clara's words had planted a seed of doubt. Mayor Thompson looked at Kane. "Caleb, you've been quiet. You've known Mr. Thorne before, haven't you? What do you think?" All eyes turned to Kane. He straightened up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the center of the room, his calloused hands resting on the back of a wooden chair. He didn't look at Silas's men who were watching him from the corners of the room. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, the people he had come to call his own. "I won't tell you what to do," Kane began, his voice low but cutting through the tension. "You've all got to make your own choice, but a man can't just buy land. Not really. Not when it's your home. Not when it's your history." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I knew Silas Thorne years ago. He was an outlaw, a very good one. He was known for leaving no witnesses and taking anything he wanted. Men like that, they don't change. Not really. They just find new ways to steal. Today it's land, tomorrow ... It'll be more, your dignity, your way of life." A man named Frank, a new arrival who had lost everything in a failed mining venture, stood up. "That's a strong claim, Kane. You've got no proof. The man's a respected businessman now. Are you just trying to hold this town back out of some old grudge?" Kane met his eyes. "Proof. Look around. He just got here, and we're already fighting amongst ourselves. That's his way. He divides you, then he conquers you. That's all the proof you'll ever need. The railroad's a good thing, maybe. But the man bringing it, ... he's a serpent. He'll poison everything he touches. And you won't even know it's happening until you're already dead." The room was silent. Kane's words, so unlike his usual taciturn nature, had struck a chord. The glint of hope in the townsfolk's eyes was replaced with a cold, hard dose of reality. The idea of progress was tempting, but the price of it, as laid out by the town's most respected man, felt too high. Finally, Mayor Thompson addressed the room. "The offer stands for a week, so we have time to think. But I think it's clear where the town stands right now." He looked at Kane, a silent nod of thanks. "We will not be selling our land to Mr. Thorne." A few people clapped half-heartedly, but the general mood was somber. The decision was made. But now a new fear had taken root. They had said no to a powerful man. What would he do now? As the meeting broke up, Kane felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Clara, the schoolteacher. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. You were right to speak up. I've heard the stories of men like him. They're a cancer on the land. A man like you. With your past, you understand them." Kane simply nodded. He understood. Then, because he had fought them for years, he knew their tactics, their weaknesses, and their unyielding greed. He had seen too many towns fall to men just like Silas. He had made a promise to himself long ago that he would never let that happen again. Not on his watch, he walked out of the town hall and into the cool evening air. The stars were beginning to appear. a blanket of endless, indifferent diamonds. But in the distance, a small fire flickered near the edge of town, where one of the outlying farms was. A cold certainty settled in his bones. The serpent had started to squeeze, and the quiet, peaceful life he had built for himself was about to be burned to the ground. The sun, once a source of life in the Arizona territory, became a merciless accomplice to Silas Thorne's campaign of terror. It baked the ground, cracked the riverbeds, and seemed to drain the very hope from the people of redemption. But Thorne, the self-proclaimed harbinger of progress, wasn't content to wait on nature's cruelty. He was a man of action, and his pressure was a slow, methodical poison designed to wither the town from the inside out. The first blow landed not with a bang, but with a trickle, or rather, the lack of one, the town's communal well, a lifeblood that had sustained redemption for years, began to yield less and less water. At first, it was a minor inconvenience, a few more turns of the crank for a bucketful. Then it became a daily struggle. A faint, oily film appeared on the surface, and the water tasted of something metallic and foul. Soon, a handful of families fell ill with stomach ailments, and the well was declared UNDRINKABLE. And a few of the more experienced homesteaders rode out to the spring that fed the well. They followed the winding path of the creek through the parched land, their boots picking up clouds of fine red dust. The spring itself was clear, its water cold and pure, but a mile downstream, where the water meandered close to a small, recently established claim on land owned by one of Silas's new men, they found it. A hidden, shallow ditch had been dug, diverting a significant portion of the flow into a sandy basin. Worse, a few yards away, Kane found a burlap sack, and inside it, a pile of rancid meat. The stench was a sickening combination of decay and sulfur, and the oily slick on the rocks told a story of deliberate contamination. "He's not trying to kill us with poison," Kane said, his jaw tight. "He's trying to break our spirit, making us fight over the last drops of water." The discovery brought a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of a bullet in a duel, but the gnawing, pervasive terror of seeing a slow, painful end for your family. The town council met again, their faces etched with newfound worry. A few men, voices trembling, argued that maybe Silas's offer was a kindness after all. Better to take his coin than to die of thirst. Kane stood and spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his conviction. "If we give in now, you think this stops? You think he buys your land and lets you stay? He'll take the water, he'll take the land, and he'll leave you with nothing but dust and promises." His words rallied the more stubborn among them, but the fear was a seed, and Silas's men were the gardeners. The next blow was more direct. A small herd of cattle, the life savings of the Miller family, vanished overnight. They weren't just gone. The tracks showed they had been driven off with professional precision. The Millers were broken. Without their cattle, they had nothing. They'd packed their wagon and, with tears in their eyes, headed east. Their dreams turned to dust. A few days later, a second family left. Then a third. The exodus was slow, but it was relentless. Every departure was a victory for Thorne, a check in redemption's armor. Kane watched the wagons roll out of town, the silent farewells. A heavy weight on his shoulders. He knew this game. It was psychological warfare. Thorn wasn't a brute with a club. He was a serpent, and he was constricting his prey until it suffocated. The climax of this insidious campaign came on a night when the wind was low and the moon was shrouded by clouds. The Redemption General Store, a 2-story building that was the heart of the town's commerce and social life, went up in flames. The fire was not a sudden explosion. It started with a quiet flicker at the back wall, a small fire fed by kerosene. By the time the townspeople woke to the smell of smoke, the flames had already consumed the back half of the building. Men rushed with buckets, but it was a futile gesture. The store burned to the ground, a skeletal wreck of charred wood and smoldering ashes. The owner, a kind man named Samuel, stood watching the destruction, his face pale in the light of the fire. He was a man with a bad leg who had invested everything he had into the store. Now he stood with his hands hanging at his sides, as if the fire had burned away his very will. "They didn't even leave a note," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "Just a match." The next day, a man from Thorn's camp, a gaunt fellow with a scar that ran from his temple to his chin, rode into town. He wore no badge and had no official capacity, but his message was clear. "Mr. Thorn sends his sympathies. Terribly sorry about your little accident. He wanted me to remind you that if the town were to sell the land, a new store could be built, a better one." The audacity was breathtaking. They were openly mocking them. For the first time, Cain saw true rage on the faces of his neighbors. They had been patient, but the destruction of their store felt like a violation of everything they held dear. The town council met in what was left of the schoolhouse, a somber meeting with the flickering light of a single lantern. The fear was palpable, but so was the anger. A young man named Lucas, a hothead with a reputation for a quick draw, slammed his fist on the table. "We gotta fight back. We can't just stand here and let him burn us out. Let's ride out and teach that serpent a lesson." A few men murmured in agreement. This was the reaction Silas wanted. A desperate, emotional charge that he could easily crush and then use as a reason to take everything. "No," Cain said, his voice cutting through the rising tide of reckless anger. All eyes turned to him. This is what he wants. He wants us to come to him out there, where his men have the high ground and the advantage. He wants to wipe us out and call it self-defense. "So what do? Cain demanded another man, his voice full of despair. "Sit here and let him pick us off one by one?" Cain looked at each man, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We prepare. We don't go to him. We make this town a fortress. We make him come to us, where we have the advantage, where we're fighting for our homes, our families. We make him pay a price he can't afford." He saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt, but he also saw a flicker of hope. He had traded his badge for a hammer, but the marshal in him had never truly died. Now, he was a different kind of lawman, a reluctant defender. He wasn't enforcing the law of a distant government. He was defending the unwritten law of a community. The next morning, the town was a hive of quiet, grim activity. Men and women worked side by side, not to rebuild, but to fortify. Barricades were erected from charred lumber. Sentries were posted on the rooftops. The town's one rusty old cannon, a relic from the Civil War, was dragged to the center of the street and cleaned. Cain. In the center of it all was a man transformed. The blacksmith's apron was gone, replaced with worn leather. The calluses on his hands felt different now. They were the calluses of a fighter, not a craftsman. He wasn't a lawman, but a man protecting his own. He was the ghost of a past the town didn't know he had, and he was about to make that ghost very real. He had tried to live a quiet life, to bury the violence that had once defined him. But Silas Thorne, the man who was a dark mirror of his past, had forced his hand. He had learned the hard way that some men will always choose damnation over redemption, and now redemption itself would have to choose its side. The air in redemption had grown thick, not with dust, but with a palpable tension. The small, calculated acts of sabotage had become a constant nagging dread. A poisoned well here, a broken fence there. It was a disease spreading through the town, a poison dripping from the serpent's fangs. But the disease was now evolving. It had found its new form in the cold, unfeeling stare of death. It was Jedediah Miller's son, Thomas, who found the body. Thomas was a young man of 20, full of life with a stubborn loyalty to his father and the land. He had ridden out at dawn, a bag of oats and a canteen slung over his shoulder, to check on their small, isolated mining claim on the far side of Broken Creek Canyon. He'd gone out to inspect a new vein of ore his father had been working. When he didn't return by supper, Jedediah, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the grit of the earth, had come to Cain. "He's not usually this late, Cain," Jedediah had said, his voice a low tremble of worry. "He knows his mother gets sick with worry." Cain hadn't needed to ask for more details. He'd seen that look 100 times. A father's fear. He'd grabbed his hat, leaving the rhythmic comfort of his forge behind. He found Jedediah's horse tied to a mesquite tree, the reins loose and swaying in the evening breeze. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, painting the mesas in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. Thomas's canteen was on the ground, still half full, a sure sign that he hadn't left voluntarily. The air in the canyon was cooler, the silence more profound. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful, but expectant, like a held breath before a gunshot. They found him at the entrance to the mine. Thomas wasn't in the mine itself. His body was laid out at the mouth, almost ceremoniously. A pile of loose rocks had collapsed on him, crushing his chest. The sight was horrific, a brutal display of indifference. Jedediah fell to his knees, a raw, keening sound ripped from his throat. Cain knelt beside the body, his face a mask of stone. He didn't just see a body, he saw a story. The story was in the details. The dirt on Thomas's clothes wasn't just mine dust. It was a different kind of soil, darker, from a different part of the canyon. And the rocks that had killed him hadn't fallen from above. They had been carefully, deliberately stacked. He found a small, peculiar marking etched into one of the stones, a symbol like a snake's coiled tail. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. Cain helped Jedediah carry his son's body back to town, the silence between them a heavy, crushing weight. The news spread through redemption like wildfire. The simmering anger that had been bubbling just beneath the surface finally boiled over. Men and women gathered in the dusty street, their faces contorted with grief and a simmering rage. The whispered threats from Silas Thorne had now become a brutal reality. Cain stood before the townspeople, his powerful frame a pillar of granite in the flickering light of the lanterns. He held the stone with the serpent's mark in his hand. "This wasn't an accident," he said, his voice low and firm. "This was murder." He explained his findings: the displaced dirt, the deliberately stacked rocks. He held up the symbol. "This is Silas's mark. He didn't just send a message. He declared a war." A clamor rose from the crowd. Some demanded retribution, blood for blood. Others, terrified by the cold brutality of the act, begged to just take the money and leave, to save themselves. This was the moment of truth for redemption. Would they stand and fight, or would they scatter like scared rabbits? Jedediah, his face streaked with tears and dirt, looked at Cain. "What do we do, Cain? What do we do?" Cain looked at the grieving father, at the terrified faces of the townsfolk. He looked at the mark on the stone. His mind went back to a time and a place he had tried to bury, a lawless land where men like Silas reigned. He remembered the feeling of a cold badge on his chest, the weight of a duty he had sworn to uphold. He had run from that life, but that life had just caught up to him. He could no longer pretend to be just a blacksmith. His eyes found his own reflection in the darkened window of a store. He saw not a blacksmith, but the man he had once been, the marshal, the one who had hunted men like Silas Thorne across half the country. He saw the cold resolve, the quiet fury. It was a man he had tried to kill, to bury beneath layers of soot and honest work. But that man was still alive, and he was needed now more than ever. Cain closed his hand around the stone, the sharp edges digging into his palm. "We fight," he said, the word cutting through the noise. It wasn't a call to arms, not yet. It was a statement of fact, a simple, unyielding truth. We fight for Thomas. We fight for our land. We fight for redemption. The words were not delivered with a fiery passion, but with a quiet, undeniable authority. It was a decision made not out of a desire for glory, but out of a grim acceptance of what had to be done. The town was his responsibility now. He had chosen to live among these people, to forge a new life, and now he had to defend it. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded the discovery of the body. This silence was one of purpose. The town had found its leader. It had found its voice. It had found its conviction. They would not give in to fear. They would not sell their souls to a man like Silas Thorne. They would stand. They would fight. And they would make their last stand at Broken Creek. The sun, a relentless eye in the sky, had bleached the desert of its color, turning the scrub brush to a dull gray and the soil to a pale dust. But the lack of color did nothing to dampen the fire that had been lit in redemption. The town, for so long a place of quiet retreat, was now a coiled spring of simmering tension. The morning after the death of the homesteader's son, Cain stood not at his forge, but in the center of the town square, his presence a silent declaration. He had shed his blacksmith's leather apron. In its place, he wore a worn denim jacket and a pair of dusty jeans that had seen too many miles. The change was subtle, but to those who knew him, it was profound. It was the unsheathing of a man who had been hidden for years. The townsmen gathered around him, their faces a mix of fear and grim determination. Old Man Henderson was there, and Joe Wallace, and a dozen of his farmers, shopkeepers, and a few young men who had never held anything more dangerous than a shovel. They looked to Cain, their quiet leader, and saw not the blacksmith, but the shadow of the marshal. Cain's voice, when he finally spoke, was not the roaring command of a general, but the low, steady rumble of a man who understood the stakes. "Silas isn't playing a game anymore," he said, his gaze sweeping over each face. "He's a snake, and he's going to squeeze us dry. First our land, then our livelihoods, and finally our lives." He held up the belt with his old, polished six-shooter, the steel gleaming even in the dull morning light. "This town can either be a tomb or a fortress. It's our choice." A tense silence followed. No one wanted to fight, but the alternative was annihilation. "What are we going to do, Cain?" A young man named Tom asked, his voice trembling. Cain's eyes, as hard and clear as a mountain stream, rested on Tom. "We're going to make a stand. We're going to turn this town into a trap he can't walk away from." He began to lay out his plan, his words painting a detailed picture of fortifications and ambushes. He spoke of choke points at the entrances to town, of barrels of water hidden in case of fire, and of designated lookouts. He wasn't just a man with a gun. He was a tactician, a man who understood how to wage a war of survival. His first lesson wasn't about shooting. It was about thinking. "A gun is just a tool," he said, taking out a handful of bullets. "It's a hammer. It doesn't know right from wrong. The man holding it does." He taught them how to clean their rifles, how to handle the weight of a Winchester, and how to sight down the barrel. But his most important lesson was about fear. "You're all scared. That's good. A man who isn't scared is a man who's already dead. But you can't let it freeze you up. Use it. Let it make you sharper, faster, smarter." Days bled into one another, marked by the steady work of preparing for the coming storm. They dug trenches and filled sandbags. The women and children, though terrified, played their part, cooking food, melting lead for bullets, and tending to the growing pile of medical supplies. The town was no longer a collection of individual homes, but a single, living organism, all its parts working toward a common goal. But as the days went on, doubts began to creep in. A man named Peterson, who had a wife and 3 small children, pulled Cain aside one evening. "I don't know if I can do this, Cain. I've never hurt a soul. How can I pull a trigger on a man?" Cain looked at Peterson, seeing the fear in his eyes. He didn't offer platitudes. "You don't do it for yourself," he said softly. "You do it for those 3 children. You do it so they don't have to live in a world where a man like Silas Thorne gets to take whatever he wants." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of battles. They were a truth that Peterson understood in his bones. Cain wasn't just a leader. He was a confessor, a man who carried the burdens of others as if they were his own. He listened to their fears and insecurities, and with each quiet conversation, he built not just a defense, but a trust. He told them stories, not of glorious victories, but of the brutal realities of a lawman's life, of ambush, of betrayals, and of the difficult choices a man has to make to stay alive. The tailies weren't meant to frighten them, but to steel them, to show them that violence was a thing to be respected, not glorified. One night, sitting by a low fire, Cain looked at his old revolver, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He'd told the men they had to be ready to fight, but he had to be ready to become a killer again. He had spent years trying to put that man to rest, to bury the marshal beneath the blacksmith. But now he was being forced to dig him up, to bring him back into the light. He thought of the young boy Silas's men had killed. The death was a call to arms, a declaration that the time for peace was over. He knew Silas wouldn't just ride in. He would be cunning, he would be ruthless, and he would use every trick in the book. Silas was not just a brute. He was a strategist. He would test their defenses, look for the weak points, and exploit their human frailties. Cain had to be one. Step ahead. He set up false trails and booby traps, not to kill, but to slow them down, to confuse them, to give his untrained men a fighting chance. He gathered a few of the younger men, those with steady hands and sharp eyes, and taught them how to set up ambushes in the surrounding canyons. The land is our ally, he told them. We know this country better than they do. Every rock, every gully, every bend in the creek can be a weapon. He taught them to move silently, to communicate with hand signals, and to blend in with the unforgiving. Landscape got as the days passed. A new kind of confidence began to grow in the town. It wasn't the false confidence of a man spoiling for a fight, but the quiet resolve of a person who has accepted the reality of their situation. The townspeople were no longer just victims. They were defenders. They were no longer waiting for the storm to pass. They were preparing to meet it head-on. Then a rider came in, dust-caked and exhausted. He was a scout from a nearby town, a man Cain had known from his days as a marshal. He had a simple, terrifying message. Silas Thorne and his men were on the move. They were headed straight for redemption. The time for preparation was over. Cain stood in the town square, the full weight of the town's trust on his shoulders. The men looked at him, their faces pale but firm. Cain didn't have to say a word. He just nodded, and the men went to their posts. The final hours before the storm were a quiet vigil. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the faint smell of gunpowder. The only sounds were the creak of a rifle being raised and the low murmur of prayers. Cain stood alone, his hand on the butt of his pistol. The blacksmith had been buried. The marshal was ready. The time for redemption was at hand, and it would be paid for in lead and blood. The air in redemption had grown thin and sharp, not from the high plains altitude, but from the suffocating tension that had settled over the town. Every man and woman walked with a new kind of awareness, their eyes scanning the dusty street, their ears tuned for the telltale creak of a carriage or the distant rumble of Silas Thorne's approaching wrath. The low, mournful tolling of the church bell had replaced the clang of Cain's hammer, a grim signal to the new reality. Cain stood in the center of town, a man remade. The blacksmith's apron was gone, replaced by a worn leather vest and the creased, dusty jeans of his old life. The hammer lay unused in his forge, its purpose now supplanted by the cold, familiar weight of the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was no longer just the town's quiet strength. He was its last line of defense, the weathered shepherd preparing his flock for a wolf. He knew all too well his small militia, no more than 20 men farmers with calloused hands, a saloon keeper with a trembling lip, and the town's doctor with a shotgun gathered around him. They were a motley crew, their courage a fragile thing built on desperation and faith in a man they barely knew. The creek bed, Kane said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. We'll make our stand there. The canyon walls are high. They'll funnel them right to us. We'll be on the bluffs where they can't flank us. Old man Henderson, his face a road map of hard living, spat on the ground. They'll just ride around. Kane, this land's bigger than their ambition. No, Kane said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could already see Silas's advance. Silas is a showman. He wants to beat us, not just break us. He'll ride straight through. He wants to make an example of this town. Show everyone what happens when they get in his way. He wants this to be a statement. His words, simple as they were, resonated with a deeper truth. This wasn't just about land or money for Silas. It was about a personal vendetta, a final, brutal contest between two ghosts of the past. Silas couldn't just win. He had to dominate. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds and shades of rust and blood, a lone rider approached the town. It wasn't a scout or an attacker, but an envoy. He carried a white flag, and the town's makeshift sentinels held their fire. A collective breath held in their lungs. The rider dismounted, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He was one of Silas's men, a ruthless killer named Jedediah, known for his cold efficiency. He handed a folded piece of paper to Kane, his eyes holding a mixture of respect and disdain. Silas's word, he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. Read it. Kane unfolded the paper. The note was penned in an elegant, looping script that belied its brutal content. There was no pretense, no negotiation. Caleb, you are a ghost in a land of the living, clinging to a past that never was. This town, these people, they are not your flock. They are sheep for the slaughter. I'm giving you one last chance to do the smart thing. You ride out alone at dawn. The rest of them will be spared. If you don't, I will wipe redemption from the map. Not a single soul will remain. Don't be a fool. You know what I'm capable of, and you know what I have to prove. The letter was signed with a flourish. Est. A hush fell over the gathered townsfolk as Kane finished reading. The words, though not spoken aloud, hung in the air like a death sentence. What did he say, Kane? Sheriff Dalton, a man who had long since hung up his badge in favor of a quiet life, asked. His voice filled with dread. Kane's face was a mask of granite. He crumpled the paper in his hand. He's giving us an ultimatum. Surrender, or we all die. He looked at the townsmen, their faces pale in the fading light. He wants me. He'll leave you be, if I ride out alone. A chorus of protests erupted. No, we're with you, Henderson cried, his voice shaky but firm. We can't give you up, Kane. Someone else shouted. You're our only chance. The sun was a malevolent eye in the morning sky, casting long, sharp shadows over the canyon leading to Broken Creek. The air was thick with the dust of ages and the grim certainty of the coming fight. The wind, a constant, mournful voice, whistled through the jagged rock, Formations. Carrying the scent of dry earth and the metallic tang of fear. Caleb, Cain's stone, his blacksmith's apron traded for a worn leather vest and his hammer for a pair of Colt single-action army revolvers, stood atop a low ridge. Below him, the men of redemption farmers, shopkeepers, a barber, and even the timid town clerk were spread out in a defensive line. Their faces were a mixture of terror and grim resolve. They were not soldiers, and this was not a battle they had chosen, but a stand they were forced to make. The conflict, once a shadow play of sabotage and intimidation, was now a brutal, naked reality. Remember what I told you? Cain's voice was a low rumble, carrying an authority forged in countless past skirmishes. Wait for the signal. Aim for the center mass. And don't waste your bullets. Silas Thorne and his gang of hired guns appeared like a stain on the horizon. They rode without hurry, a deliberate insult. There were a dozen of them, hard men who looked as if they had been born in the saddle, their faces chiseled from stone, and their eyes as empty as a well in a drought. They were professionals, and the men of redemption were amateurs, armed with little more than desperation. Silas, riding at the front, was a vision of dark elegance. His black hat and tailored coat stood out against the dusty backdrop. He raised his hand, and his men halted. He was putting on a show, a theater of power meant to break the spirit of the defenders before a shot was even fired. He had misjudged them. The first shot was a clean, sharp crack that echoed across the canyon. It came not from Silas's men, but from the rocks above where a young homesteader had panicked. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust at Silas's feet. A moment of silence stretched, taut as a wire, before Silas's grim smile appeared. "Fools," he muttered to his men. "Light them up." The canyon erupted. Muzzle flashes blossomed along Silas's line, and bullets whined like angry wasps. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder. A few of the townsmen, caught in the open, fell back with gasps of pain. There, makeshift courage giving way to the cold reality of lead, Cain roared, a sound torn from a place he'd long suppressed. "Hold your fire, hold it." He watched as Silas's men charged. It was a brutal wave, a stampede of death. But Cain had planned for this. He raised his rifle and fired. The sound was a deep, resonant boom that signaled the true beginning of the fight. The first outlaw went down, not from Cain's bullet, but from a well-placed tripwire that sent him sprawling, his horse tumbling over him. It was a simple trick, but in the chaos, it was a deadly one. The townsmen, seeing the unexpected advantage, found their courage again. They began firing from behind rock outcroppings and hastily dug trenches. They were poor shots, but they were many, and their collective fire was a storm. One of Silas's men was hit and his horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground, where he was quickly surrounded. Silas, his face a mask of rage, realized this wasn't going to be the quick, brutal massacre he'd planned. He turned to his lieutenant, a man named Taggart. "Get around their flank. Flank them and pin them down." The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Cain moved like a ghost through the smoke and gunfire, a man reborn. He was no longer the quiet blacksmith. He was the marshal, a master of his deadly trade. He stalked from one position to the next, offering words of encouragement, reloading rifles, and with cold precision, picking off targets. He didn't fire to kill, but to maim, to disarm, to take away the threat. He shot one man's gun from his hand, another in the leg, and another's horse. It was a calculated form of violence, a silent statement that he was not the killer Silas was. The climax of the battle came when Silas, infuriated by his losses, charged forward, his remaining men at his back. He rode directly for Cain's position, seeking to end the fight with a personal confrontation. His eyes, burning with a mix of fury and contempt, were fixed on Cain. Cain met the charge head-on. He emptied his revolver, each shot a deliberate action. One of Silas's men fell, another's rifle was shattered. Finally, Silas was the only one left riding. He pulled his own revolver and fired. The shot went wide. He was out of ammunition. "It's over, Silas," Cain said, his voice as steady as the mountain. Silas sneered. "It's never over, Stone, not for men like us." He drew a wicked-looking bowie knife. "You've forgotten the old ways." Cain knew he was right. This was not a gunfight. This was the final, brutal confrontation between two men from a world long gone. Cain put his revolvers down. He reached into his belt and pulled out a smaller, more practical weapon, a simple forged knife, one he'd made himself. The two men circled each other, their shadows dancing on the canyon floor. Silas lunged, a flurry of steel. Cain moved with a practiced grace, deflecting the blows. Their fight was a silent dance of death. It was not a battle of strength, but of skill and will. Cain's hands were as powerful and precise as they were when he worked the forge, and he used that power to block, parry, and twist. Silas was faster, but Cain was a brick wall. He took a cut to his forearm, but didn't even flinch. He used the distraction to lock his free hand around Silas's wrist. He squeezed. He didn't fight with fury, but with a cold, controlled determination. Silas roared in pain as his fingers went numb. He dropped his knife. Cain pinned Silas to the ground, his own knife to Silas's throat. He could feel the pulse beating furiously under the blade. The dust of the canyon floor coated Silas's fine suit. The air was thick with the scent of fear. "Kill me, then," Silas spat, his eyes wild. "You're a killer." "You always were." Cain looked into the eyes of the man who had brought a war to his town. He saw the same man he'd chased a decade ago, a man with no sense of right or wrong, only power. The easy choice, the instinctual choice, was to end it right here. It would be over. The town would be safe. He could go back to his forge. He could pretend the past had never returned, but the eyes of the townsmen were on him, watching from the ridge, a silent jury. He was no longer just Cain the blacksmith, or even Cain the marshal. He was their leader, their protector. He had to show them the difference between justice and vengeance. He had to show them what it meant to choose a new path. He pressed the flat of the knife against Silas's neck, the cold steel a stark reminder of the man he could be. "You're right," Cain said, his voice a low whisper. "I could kill you, but that would make me just like you, and I'm not. I don't give a man a bullet when a rope will do. You'll stand trial for every life you've taken, every home you've burned." Cain slowly pulled the knife back. He holstered it with a practiced motion. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not a powerful railroad baron, but a broken, defeated man. He was no longer the serpent, but a worm. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader captured and their fight lost, scattered like dust in the wind. The townsmen slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale with shock and relief. They didn't cheer. There was no joy in this victory, only the profound exhaustion that comes with survival. Cain walked over to the men who had been wounded, checking their bandages, giving them quiet words of encouragement. He was a blacksmith again, but one with the authority of a marshal. He had made his choice. He had chosen redemption, both for his town and for himself. And in the silence of the canyon, with the dust settling and the sun a little less angry, he knew he had finally found peace. Not the peace of a man who runs from his past, but the peace of a man who has faced it and finally won. The first light of dawn was a gray, unforgiving line on the horizon, painting the sky with the bruised colors of a coming fight. The wind, a constant, mournful presence in the canyon, had picked up overnight, carrying the fine, red dust into every crevice and a sense of foreboding into every man. They were arrayed in the mouth of Broken Creek Canyon, a natural choke point that funneled anyone who approached through a narrow gauntlet of sheer rock walls. It was a place designed by nature for a last stand. Cain stood at the head of the small, weary line of defenders. Gone was the blacksmith's apron. He was clad in worn leather and denim, a heavy rifle in his hands. His face, etched with a decade's worth of quiet pain, was now a mask of grim determination. He looked at the faces around him, old man Henderson, his hands trembling but his eyes fierce. Joe Wallace, a man of bluster now humbled and ready to fight for his home. Young Billy, wide-eyed but resolute. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers and merchants, cowhands and fathers, and they were ready to die for a cause they'd only just come to understand. Cain had spent the night before walking the line, checking rifles and offering quiet words of reassurance. He had laid out the simple plan: use the canyon walls for cover, hold their fire until the last possible moment, and don't let a single one of Silas's men get through. He was a marshal again, a general leading a ragtag army, and the weight of every one of their lives rested on his shoulders. He felt the cold pressure of it, a familiar burden he had spent years trying to shed. A distant rumble grew on the wind, a sound like an approaching storm. It was the thunder of hooves, dozens of them, pounding across the hard earth. Silas Thorne was coming. "Hold your positions," Cain said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind. "Wait for my signal." They came into view a few minutes later, a swirling cloud of dust that resolved into a dark, menacing column of riders. At the head was Silas, riding a magnificent black stallion. He wore a long black duster coat that billowed behind him, a dark prophet of destruction. He pulled his horse to a halt, 100 yards from the canyon's mouth. His men fanned out behind him, a semicircle of grinning, heavily armed thugs. Cain, Silas's voice amplified by the wind, was a cruel, mocking shout. "You're a fool. You and your little army of sodbusters. You think you can stand against progress?" Cain didn't answer. He just raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. The silence was his language, his answer. Silas chuckled. "Don't say I didn't warn you. This is on you, old friend." He raised a hand and gave a signal. The outlaws let out a war cry and spurred their horses forward. The ground trembled under the weight of their charge. Cain waited, the world narrowing to the sights of his rifle and the thundering hooves. He could feel the panic rising in some of the men beside him, but they held their ground. He had told them to trust him, and for this one moment they did not. At 50 yards he fired. The shot was a single, defiant crack that echoed through the canyon. One of Silas's men cried out and toppled from his horse. It was the signal. A volley of ragged gunfire erupted from the defenders' positions. The shots were not well aimed, but the sheer volume of them, coupled with the surprise, was enough. 2 more of Silas's men went down. The charge faltered. The outlaws veered to the sides, seeking cover, their bravado giving way to caution. The fight devolved into a tense, desperate siege. The outlaws, skilled at hit-and-run raids, were not prepared for a sustained confrontation. They returned fire from behind rocks and sparse bushes, but the defenders had the advantage of cover and position. The air filled with the sharp snap of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Cain moved with an effortless grace that belied his years. He was a phantom, moving from one position to the next, offering advice, firing carefully aimed shots. He shot to wound, not to kill, a rule he hadn't thought about in years, but that his muscle memory still followed. A well-placed shot from his rifle took out one man's knee, another's shoulder. He was trying to disable, to end the fight without taking a life, even though every instinct screamed for him to take down these men who were trying to destroy everything he had built. He caught a glimpse of Silas, watching from a distance, his face a mask of furious disbelief. Silas had expected an easy rout, not a determined defense. He saw a man's life flash across his face, a look of utter defeat, the look of a man who was about to be undone. Silas drew his own pistol and rode forward, not with his men, but toward a narrow side pass that led to Cain's rear flank. Cain saw it. He yelled a warning to Billy, but the boy was too slow. A hulking outlaw burst from behind a rock, firing. Billy cried out, a shot hitting him in the arm. The young man crumpled, his rifle falling from his grasp. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over Cain, the kind he hadn't felt in a decade. He ran, an unstoppable force, ignoring the shots that whizzed past his head. He didn't fire. He drew his own pistol, a rusty old 6-shooter he hadn't used in years. It felt foreign and horribly familiar. He got to Billy, saw the blood on the boy's sleeve. He knew it was bad, but not mortal. He put a hand on Billy's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Stay down. You did good, son." Then he turned, a whirlwind of motion. The hulking outlaw was reloading. Cain didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle like a club, the stock connecting with the man's temple with a sickening thud. The man went down, his eyes rolling back in his head. Cain didn't stop to check. He was a man possessed, a living ghost of a marshal, and he was hunting. He ran toward the side pass, the place where Silas was trying to outflank them. He slid between 2 rocks, his breath ragged. He saw Silas, 30 yards away, dismounting, his pistol in his hand. He hadn't seen Cain. Silas. Cain's voice was a guttural roar, filled with a decade's worth of regret and rage. Silas spun, his eyes widening in shock. He brought his gun up. Cain had his own pistol ready. Time seemed to slow. The wind died down. The canyon was silent, save for the labored breathing of the two men. The climax wasn't a hail of bullets. It was a standoff, a moment of stark truth. Silas looked at Cain, not with the arrogance he'd shown before, but with a flicker of something close to fear. He saw the man he had once known, the one who had brought down 6 gangs, the one who had disappeared into the dust. He saw the man who had chosen peace, now forced to embrace war. "You can't win, Cain," Silas said, his voice a low hiss. "This is a new world. Men like us, we rule it. The law is a tool for the rich, a story for the weak." "I don't believe that," Cain said, his finger tight on the trigger. "The law is what keeps men from becoming animals. And you, Silas, you've become an animal." Silas sneered. "And what are you, then? A sheepdog pretending to be a wolf? You think you're better than me? I don't think I'm better than anyone," Cain said. "I just chose a different path." Silas's eyes hardened. He fired first. The shot went wide, a product of his overconfidence. And his own fear. Cain didn't fire. He took a step forward. Silas fired again. The bullet struck the rock beside Cain's head, a spray of shrapnel cutting his cheek. Blood ran down his face. Cain took another step. He didn't raise his gun. He was just walking, a man on a mission toward his destiny. He was not a marshal looking to kill. He was a blacksmith, a farmer, a father, a man of peace, walking toward a man of war. Silas emptied his pistol, his shots going wide, his aim ruined by a creeping, desperate panic. When his gun clicked on an empty chamber, his eyes widened in horror. Cain was a yard away. He grabbed Silas's wrist, the force of his grip a testament to years of forging steel. Silas dropped the empty gun. He swung at Cain with his other hand. Cain blocked it effortlessly. He didn't hit back. He just held Silas there, his grip unyielding. "It's over, Silas," Cain said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You're done." Silas struggled, his eyes wild. He was a predator brought to bay by an animal he had underestimated. He saw not a man with a gun, but the spirit of the law itself, unyielding and unbreakable. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, desperate terror. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader captured and defeated, lost their will to fight. A few dropped their guns. The others turned tail and rode, a motley, cowardly retreat. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the wind and the groans of the wounded. The fight was over. The town had won. Cain released Silas's wrist. He didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the town, a silent order. Silas, a broken and defeated man, walked ahead of him, his head bowed. Cain, still bleeding from the cut on his cheek, walked after him. He was tired, so terribly tired, but he wasn't a killer. He was a man who had faced the demon of his past and had chosen a different path. He was a blacksmith, and his job was to mend things, not to break them. He had made his stand not with bullets, but with a quiet, powerful defiance that said, "Some things are worth more than land or money. Some things are worth fighting for." And he had won. The sun, a dying ember on the horizon, painted the broken landscape in hues of fiery orange and blood red. Dust, thick and heavy, hung in the air, a final witness to the violence. The fight was over. The echoes of gunshots had faded. replaced by the low moans of the wounded and the ragged breaths of men who had survived. Caleb Kane Stone, the blacksmith who had become a marshal once more, stood over the still form of Silas Thorne. Silas wasn't dead. Not yet. He lay in a crumpled heap, a dark stain spreading across his fine suit from a bullet wound in his leg. His face, once so arrogant and composed, was now a mask of pain and disbelief. He had been so sure of his power, so certain that his will would bend this town to his whim. But he had not accounted for the quiet strength of a man who had chosen. T.O. put down his gun. Kane's breath came in a ragged gasp, his chest heaving. The rifle, warm from the last shot, felt alien in his hands, a forgotten limb he had reluctantly reattached. He knelt, not in victory, but in weary resignation. He reached for the rope at his belt, the kind he used to tie down gear on his horse. Not to bind a man. Silas's eyes, full of a fading fire, flickered up at him. "You should have killed me," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You know it's what you do. It's what you always did." "No," Kane said, his voice flat. "It's what I was." The distinction was everything. For years, he had been haunted by the ghosts of the men he had killed in the line of duty, their faces and final moments etched into his memory. He had traded the badge for a hammer, the law for the forge, hoping to find a path to absolution. Tonight, he had been forced to take up his old mantle, but he would not let it consume him. He would not become the man Silas wanted him to be, a killer defined by his past. He wrapped the rope around Silas's wrists, a practiced motion that came from a deeper, more ingrained memory than his time at the anvil. Silas spat at the ground. "This isn't justice. It's a fool's errand. The law will find a way to let me go. Money talks. Marshal." Kane tied the final knot, secure and tight. "Maybe, but you'll have to walk through a dozen angry men to get to it. And the law here tonight was a good damn gun." He stood and turned to face the townsfolk. They were not cheering. There was no victory cry, only quiet relief. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, seeing the man he had been and the man he was now. He was their savior, but he was also a stranger, a force of violence they had not known lived among them. The silence was broken by old man Henderson, who hobbled over, holding a bloody rag to a gash on his arm. "We owe you, Kane, everything." Kane shook his head. "You owe yourselves. You chose to fight." He turned and began to help the wounded, his movements efficient and calm. He was a blacksmith again, but he was more. He was the man who had laid down his hammer and taken up the rifle to protect his home. He had chosen peace, but had proved he could still fight for it. The next morning, the sun rose on a changed redemption. The town was battered, but not broken. The buildings that had been spared bore the marks of a hard-won battle. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, but it was also filled with a new sense of purpose. The townspeople were cleaning up, tending to their wounded, and burying their dead. They had captured Silas and his remaining men. They were bound and waiting for the circuit judge, who was still a week's ride away. It was a long week, and Kane spent it as a kind of silent guardian. He didn't wear a badge, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. He moved between the houses, helping repair doors and walls, mending fences and spirits. He was a man of action, not of words. He spoke little, but his hands, calloused and strong, spoke for him. One evening, a little girl named Lily, whose father had been one of the men who had stood with Cain, approached him as he sat on the porch of the saloon, whittling a piece of wood. "Mr. Cain?" she asked, her voice small. He looked up, his eyes soft. "Hello, Lily. Are you a marshal? Like in the books?" Cain smiled faintly. "I was a long time ago. Why did you stop?" The question was simple, but the answer was impossibly complex. He looked at the vast, indifferent sky, at the stars beginning to prick through the twilight. "I just wanted to find a place where a man could make things instead of break them. I wanted to build." "You built our town," she said, her voice full of a child's unwavering belief. Her words struck him with the force of a hammer. He had always thought of his work at the forge as building, but he had never considered the town itself as his creation. Yet, in a way, it was. He had helped forge its spirit, and tonight that spirit had held. A week passed. The judge, a stoic man named Judge Abernathy, finally rode into town. He looked at the wreckage and the bound outlaws and listened to the testimony of the townspeople. His gaze fell on Cain, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his posture straight, his hands tucked into his pockets. The judge called him forward. "I hear you're the one who stood up to them, Mr. Stone. Saved this town." Cain just nodded. "The railroad will not be pleased," the judge said, a note of warning in his voice. "Thorne has powerful friends. They'll have to find new ones," Cain said. "He won't be building any railroads from a prison cell." The judge stared at him for a long moment. Then a slow, tired smile spread across his face. "I agree, and I believe the law has been served here." The outlaws were taken away, their fate sealed. The stagecoach that had brought Silas and his men now carried them away, leaving behind a silence that was almost deafening. Dot, as the sun began to set on the day of the trial, Cain walked back to his forge. He stood in the doorway, looking at the anvil, the hammers, the tools of his trade. He had laid down the badge, and he had been a blacksmith. He had picked up the gun, and now he was putting it down again. He was no longer just the retired marshal, haunted by his past, nor was he just the quiet blacksmith. He was both, and something more. He was a man who had chosen to defend his home, not with a badge and a gun, but with the moral weight of his character. He had faced his past, and in doing so, had found a way to live with it. He picked up a piece of iron, cold and inert. He placed it in the fiery belly of the forge. He took up his hammer. The first strike rang out, a clean, sharp note that echoed through the quiet street. The sound was not a sound of violence or of battle. It was the sound of a new beginning. Cain looked around at the town he had helped save. He had faced down a powerful man who sought to destroy it, and he had done so not by becoming the man he had been, but by being the man he had become. He was a builder, not a breaker, and in the heart of redemption, with the clang of his hammer, he would continue to build. He had found his place, and at last he was home.
The story doesn't end here. More tailies are waiting at your fingertips. Tap the next one and keep the journey alive. And don't forget, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to hear every new story the moment it's told.